Hello everybody, and welcome back to Writing the Rapids, the show where I, Joe Bielecki, talk to writers about writing. Very often those writers have been recommended to me by writers who have previously been on the show. In the case of this month's guest, James Pate was recommended to me by M4 Writer. James Pate is a fiction writer and poet. He was born in Memphis, lived many years in Chicago, and now lives in West Virginia. He's the author of The Fassbender Diaries from Civil Coping Mechanisms, Flowers Among the Carrion by Action Books, and Speed of Life by Fahrenheit Press. He's had work published in Black Warrior Review, Blue Mesa Review, Berkeley Fiction Review, New Delta Review, Cream City Review, Plots with Guns, Story South, Le Petit Zine, Pembroke Magazine, Superstition Review, and Shotgun Honey, among other places, and I'm very excited to talk to him today. If you would like to help out the show, you can do so in a couple different ways. You can throw me $2 a month on Patreon, patreon.com/noisemakerjoe. It really does help every little bit. I recently had to reschedule this interview because the mixer I have been using for years and years and years died, and having a Patreon and having some faithful patrons really took the sting out of such an occurrence happening. You can also throw a one-time donation to me over at paypal.me/noisemakerjoe. You can buy my book. It's called Tired. Or you can not spend any money and just talk about the show. That helps. Like and subscribe. Now, without further ado, let's get into my conversation with James. I wanted to begin with something from Speed of Life, because I think it's a good way to get the pulse of who I'm talking to. At the end of chapter 2, so very early on, they're talking about Tommy and Oscar and their sort of competing philosophies about what it takes to make art. Brian told him, taking his keys from his pocket, "I think it was different for Tommy. I doubt that dude ever wrote a thing he didn't think was composed with his own blood." And then Oscar basically said that that's kind of the opposite is true for him previously. So I'm wondering where James Pate falls in that dichotomy.
Yeah. Sure. No, it's a good question. And first of all, thanks for inviting me on the podcast. I know we've had to do like some rescheduling over time, but yeah, it's I really enjoy your podcast and thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's so when I was like writing the novel, I was like thinking specifically of like Lennon and Paul McCartney, the Beatles, and the reputation that they have, like John Lennon as being a kind of like tormented artist who's like writing from like the the center of his being, and Paul McCartney as somebody who's like a very good craftsperson, a very good songwriter, but who maybe doesn't have like that sense of authenticity. But then like kind of like when you think through it, I mean, some of like the Beatles most like disturbing songs like Helter Skelter, for example. That's a Paul McCartney song, so it's so I mean, there are like ways in which when you like look at their actual music, there's ways in which some of the songs seem to like undercut that usual dichotomy of how we think about that group. And Speed of Life is based on a Memphis group called Big Star, with Alex Shelton, who was a member of it. And they did a series of about 3 albums that became like cult hits later on, and became like influential for groups like REM and groups in the 90s. But Speed of Life, the 2 main characters are based loosely on Alex Shelton and Chris Bell, and very loosely. I don't want to get sued or anything. So very loosely on those 2 musicians. And those 2 musicians are often thought of in a kind of like Lennon, Paul McCartney way, of like Alex Shelton as being the John Lennon of the group in some ways, and Bell being Chris Bell as being the Paul McCartney of the group. And so I think that dichotomy is like interesting in terms of like 2 ideas, like being an artist, as you bring up with that quote, the idea of like the authentic artist who's like, painting or writing with their blood, the essence of their being. And another vision of the artist, which is maybe more, I don't want to use the word craftsperson, but more kind of like maybe like ironic or more conceptual when they think about writing or composing music. And for one thing, I think that dichotomy is interesting. But I also think it's like really interesting when that dichotomy is like shaken up in some ways. So to go back to Big Star and Alex Chilton and Chris Spell, there's lots of ways in which Alex Chilton, even though on the surface level he seems like a tormented artist, he also had this kind of like a punk sense of irony to a lot of the work that he did. And there's a kind of like weird distance that he has. So on one level, you can listen to his songs and think, wow, this is like really coming from his soul. But during his performances, especially, he had this kind of like weirdly distant demeanor, and he would like undercut his own talent in the interviews all the time and make fun of Big Star, make fun of his most famous song is with the Box Tops, The Letter, that became famous in the 60s. And so I think that dichotomy is interesting, but also like how that dichotomy can be shaken up in all these different ways. Can you be ironic and sincere at exactly the same time? And the title of the novel is from a David Bowie song, Speed of Life. It's from Low, the first song on Low. And I think David Bowie is a good example of this. Somebody who changes different persona, who has, all of his music is so much of kind of like masquerade. He goes from like Ziggy Stardust to all sorts of different masks that he wears. And yet also there's a sense, at least to me when I listen to his music, of extreme sincerity. It's almost as if like, that mask allows him to be more authentic in this weird way, which there's that line from Oscar Wilde that artists always tell the truth when they wear a mask. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's a really intriguing idea, that dichotomy first of sincerity versus irony, but also ways in which different performers undercut that dichotomy and add a kind of like complex element to that dichotomy.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember in one of my writing classes in college having two different poets come in to talk about their writing, and one of them, this old white guy, I love these like working class old crusty white guy poets. It's like my favorite type of poetry is just some dude in his 60s writing about a tumbleweed is just the greatest thing. But he talked about how his dad was a carpenter, and so he approaches writing like he's building a chair. He approaches writing his poetry like he's building a chair. And I'll tell that to poets sometimes, and it's always interesting to see their reaction. And I think I've brought it up on the show a couple of times over the years too, because it's such like an interesting, it was such a formative thing for me to hear as someone who at the time was writing poetry but wasn't taking it very seriously. It was just I'm in the class, I'll write the poetry. Oh, this feels nice to do it. I'll do it on my own as well. And feeling like I was a very intuitive sort of like, free jazz sort of poet. And if the poems, if I get to the end of this poem and it's not good, that's fine. I'll toss it and just write another one. But this idea that you can like sit down and like have an idea of what you want to write a poem about, and then, sand it and shave it and make sure it's level and that sort of thing, was interesting. And I don't edit poems like that really, but to know that like to be given permission, a lot of what I like to hear artists talk about is me listening to them, listening for them to give me permission to do something I either hadn't thought about or have been like subconsciously stopping myself from doing, where it's like, oh, that's not, you're not supposed to, whatever. Like, I'm a very Midwest boy. Like it's very much like there's a way things are supposed to be done sort of way. But the mask bit is interesting too. And, my favorite like rap artists are often tend to be people who do like a layering of masking on top of things. And are often hailed as being great lyricists because of it, where it's like, dude, how do you even think of writing a song like that? And he's like, I don't want to tell you how I really feel. That's too scary. So I'm going to, And so I guess that the undercutting that you see artists doing of their own work too, I think maybe is part of that, right? Like it's look at how tortured you are, but also like, yeah, but I'm, it's fine, whatever. Like, who
Oh
cares?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's true. Whenever there's like it's like a musical performance. I think kind of like Bob Dylan, it's been like in the 70s, kind of like did this, where it's almost like making fun of your own performance as you're doing the performance. So it's like this strange thing of both a very intense song, but delivered in such like when like Bob Dylan, especially in the 70s, was doing strange makeup and kind of like weird dance moves, and there was that kind of like undercutting element. And yeah, I always find that like really fascinating because I always feel like, and it's like kind of like two schools of like thinking about this. Like one is that okay, like undercuts the intensity and makes the performance less intense. But I think there's another way of thinking about it is that kind of like by like breaking that fourth wall, that arguably it actually makes it more intense in some ways. Where it's like, okay, this is this is a performance. It's not somebody trying to like pretend that this isn't a performance. This is actually putting the performance aspect up front and center. And arguably that could even make that song performance even that much more kind of like in your face in a way by sort of like breaking that fourth wall.
Yeah, a bunch of examples are coming to mind as you're talking. I feel like 70s Tom Waits did this a lot.
Oh yeah,
It might have just him being drunk the whole time, but like I think there was a performativeness to it too. Like he was definitely doing a character. There's a video that's been tossed around on Instagram a lot lately of Kurt Cobain like purposefully doing a bad job because the crowd had booed off whatever Riot Girl act he had opening for them. So he came out and like did all their hits, but just badly on purpose, and like, yeah, like there's this element of like him, I understand from his perspective saying, I understand how important this is for you. Well, the thing, that you just, this act who is important to me, you just said you don't care about, so I'm going to say I don't care about the thing that you care about. Which is fascinating. That he was able to like, take the song as its own object and then exert his own power over it as the artist, so that the crowd doesn't have power over it.
Oh yeah, no, that's a good way to put it. Yeah, again, like makes it situational, so as opposed to like the song as like, okay, this like thing that you just perform for an audience. It's like this like neutral fact that you perform. It's like, no, this song is actually morphing constantly, and depending on the situation, if like Kurt Cobain's like really pissed off in this situation, that's going to be part of the performance. That it sort of like brings the situation into play in a really interesting way.
Yeah. Speed of Life as a whole, I really enjoyed. I like it felt I don't know if neo-noir is maybe the correct way to say it, but it felt like that to me. This sort of like there's lots of characters and it feels almost deterministic in a way that Oscar is kind of going to, it doesn't matter who he talks to, right? He even says at some point in the book, like, I'm not a very good detective, or we're not good detectives. But it doesn't really matter because he's gonna get to maybe, if not the bottom of it, he's going to get to a bottom. And that's something about at least film noir that I really enjoy, is this like, it's going to take me until after I'm done with it to try to wrap my head around who all these people are and how they're all connected and how possibly they could be all connected, with this sort of, especially at the end, this sort of like Tarantinoizing
Mm.
these bursts of violence that almost sidetrack the plot,
Oh
right?
yeah, yeah,
Where
yeah.
someone's about to do some exposition and you as the reader are like, oh, thank God, we're gonna get somewhere, and then his head just explodes and it takes you a second to understand what's going on.
Oh yeah.
And it's someone completely disconnected with, that interaction, but as part of the wider world.
Mm.
I really like experiencing those types of stories, whether it's a film or a movie. Yeah, 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 yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. I think in the when I was writing it, and I can't really remember. It's been a long time since I wrote it, so I can't remember how consciously I was thinking about it. But I'm really interested in narratives that both have like a kind of just everyday, almost kind of like a cinema verite aspect of like, okay, characters in a diner just like talking, or driving down the street, just like these kind of like everyday encounters. Mixed in with like really bizarre, fucked up shit. So yeah, that kind of like like tension between the two. And yeah, I think on one level, I was like thinking of like some like Godard's films or kind of like that, where you have
Mm-hmm.
like extended scenes of people just like talking about like politics or movies or something like that, and then you have like these moments of like really extreme violence in its films, especially a film like A Weekend, for example. Um, I think also I was thinking of like maybe like early Don DeLillo, and
Mm-hmm.
I much prefer early Don DeLillo than Don DeLillo later on. I've a few books of his I still like, but the early stuff I think is pretty great, and that too has like that element of like these characters just like talking about everyday things or like running errands and stuff, and then suddenly you have these moments of like of like violence or surrealism or something that feels like just like really off somehow. But then it's almost as if like the narrative reconfigures, and it's like, well, the characters are still living in the everyday world in this strange way. They have to carry on in that. So I really like that tension. And I guess we probably see that in a lot of noir, I guess, where that tension between just almost like the everyday, almost like the mundane, the banal, and those moments of extremity. Yeah, I guess. So yeah, that kind of like element of the extreme with just the most like bare bones realism, I think is always like intriguing, to me. Um, and also I'm just like really interested in genre. Like noir, I'm interested in horror. I really like the way that like thinking about like those narrative structures and how you can like reconfigure them and play with them and turn them inside out, sometimes. And so just like genre in general, I'm like really fascinated by. So when it's like writing Speed of Life, I was definitely thinking about all of those like noir elements, like how to build that sense of tension, how to decrease tension, all those sorts of elements where I play.
Yeah, I like genre too, and I'm glad I'm through this show slowly finding people who are
Mm.
interested in genre, be it sword and sorcery or horror or noir
Mm.
maybe, um, because I like playing within those frameworks.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah.
writing with constraints, creating with constraints. That's that sort of thing.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I think there's like a weird freedom to that too. There's whenever when I was like younger and was trying to like, write like quote unquote like literary fiction, I just like would struggle with it like so much. I was like it felt like strangely more constrained than when I started to write in more kind of like genre based ways. When I started to write more in terms of noir, more in terms of horror, that there's like something kind of like strangely freeing about that, because okay, you have like these different kind of like structures out there, and you can like pick and choose different ways. But then also once you have those structures, again, you can like play with them in all these different different directions. And so for me as a writer, and just like speaking just as myself, that for me, I find genre to be weirdly liberating in a way that when I was writing literary fiction, I didn't. So I mean, it took me a long time to get to that point. I mean, I really didn't start writing in a more kind of like genre direction until like about like 2011, 2000. So I was like writing like literary fiction for a long time before I realized, oh, wait a minute, when I get like really excited about writing, it is when I'm like thinking about these genre, elements, to it.
Yeah, I mean, going back to maybe even the first topic, I find in myself too that when I get the most excited about something I'm writing, it often is, if not steeped in genre, less self serious than you would expect literary fiction
Oh,
to be.
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
think I could write a novel about an aging broadcaster,
Oh, yeah.
trying to write a novel, that sort of
Oh,
thing.
yeah. 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 No, that's true. Oh, yeah. No, yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm exactly the same way. Yeah. That there's like something about the fact that it like seems like less quote unquote serious. I think that's probably like the kind of like for me the liberative element as well. That if it's like, okay, this is noir, this is crime fiction, this is horror, that it's not put on the pedestal in the same way as like so-called literary fiction. And yeah, there's something like freeing about that as well. You can just kind of, it's more playful, I guess you could say, than if you're like taking yourself like really seriously as a writer and thinking that, okay, my own personal life experiences, I have to get them on the page, I have to show my personal angst, et cetera, et cetera. I guess like kind of like going back to that mask idea, that genre allows you to wear a mask, a persona. And yeah, there's something exciting about that. And not just like one mask, but you can try different masks. Like when I write horror, my mind is functioning in a very different way than when I write noir. And that's fun to me. I
Yeah.
like to feel my mind functioning in weird, different ways. Poetry, the same thing. When I write poetry, it's almost like I can like physically feel a different part of my brain operating than when I write fiction. And I find that like really enthralling. Yeah, it's like feeling like, okay, this is like, this is me when I write horror, this is me when I write noir, this is me when I write poetry. And I don't really feel like I have to be necessarily somehow consistent within that, because I feel like this me writing it creates its own consistency in a strange way. I don't feel like I have to have like a certain number of themes that carry across all the different works in some sort of like neon flashing way, but just like hopefully on some subtle way, since it's me writing in these very different modes, that allows some sort of cohesion between these very different projects that I work on.
Yeah. I know exactly what you mean about like how it feels in your brain to write prose versus poetry and versus I don't know, fiction versus essay. And that's actually something I had in mind to mention to you, is that, I read Speed of Life, obviously, and Flowers Among the Carrion and Mineral Planet. So I read essay, poetry, and novel from you. And they all, like, it does feel like I have experienced very different aspects of you. Where some people, I can't think of any examples right now, but like some people I'll read and they'll be like, okay, yeah, this is going to be way different from what I normally do. And it feels like them, like really strongly, even if the plot is different or whatever, like, oh, this is a this person book, like through and through.
Oh yeah.
It's interesting to see you working in these different modes and to do so kind of quickly too. Within a month, reading those 3 books back to back, basically. It is interesting, and kind of nice to know too that like you're not working with the idea of like trying to create a brand.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, no, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and for me, I think like some of it is just if I write like fiction for too long of a time period, I feel like it's almost like my brain is saying, write more poetry now, or if I like write poetry for like several months on end, part of my brain will feel like I want to start writing fiction again, or an essay, or nonfiction, or a review or something like that. And so yeah, part of it is just kind of, like wanting to experience writing in those different modes. And if I do write in one particular mode for a really long time, I do get this kind of like this like hunger, this hankering for writing in a different mode. And like over this past summer, I've been working on a novel and a book of poetry, and I find it like really refreshing to go back and forth between the two. And sometimes I'll notice that if I work on poetry for a few days and then return to the novel, that the language, for me at least, when I'm writing, it feels fresher. It feels like there's something more alive to it, more vibrant. And then vice versa, if I like write fiction and then go to the poetry project, I feel like, okay, there's like certain elements like structure that maybe I'm able to do better than I would be able to do if I was simply writing poetry for just months on end. Yet, and again, only speaking for myself here, but for me as a writer, it really does help to have like one feed off of each other. I don't feel like fiction takes away from poetry or poetry takes away from fiction. For me, when I'm working on these different projects, they do feed into each other in that way. Their energies kind of like feed into each other, even though they're very different energies in that way.
I'm right there with you. That is how I feel. Especially in the last year or so, sort of sitting down and saying, you know what, let's try to do a book length collection of poetry. Like let's develop a theme and let's try to do it, and then bouncing back and forth between whatever various prose project is most exciting me at the time and trying to get some essays out and that sort of thing. And it's like, yeah, it's really nice to be able to not be stuck as as a poet or as a prosist or whatever. Like it's nice to say, I can't do sentences today, so we're doing line breaks.
Oh yeah, that's true. Yeah, I really agree with that, because there's been like sometimes this past summer where in the morning I tried like start like working on a novel, and it's like, okay, this probably just going to happen today. So I switched to poetry, and it's like, okay, no, now I'm feeling like things are kind of like flowing, or vice versa. So yeah, for me, being able to like switch through different projects, different modes, like really helps. And as I was like saying before, I do really feel like they don't contradict each other. I think they actually work together in a weird way. There is a kind of like a synchronicity between them, different modes.
Yeah, you gotta do lifting and cardio.
Oh yeah,
that's true. Sort of, I think it does help it. It helps it all get better. I have long maligned that I have simply too many ideas for how much energy I have to work on them. And it does help a little bit to say, okay, I'm not going to do this start to finish without anything else distracting me. But it is nice to say, okay, we'll have the poetry thing, and we'll have the manuscript thing, and then we'll work on editing something else that's more finished, and have a couple things all going on at the same time. And maybe, the ship has sailed on me doing a novel every year. The ship has probably sailed on me doing a novel every 5 years. But it's nice to at least feel like I'm doing something rather than constantly starting over again.
Oh yeah. I really feel that. Yeah, the same way. And even like when I was like writing Speed of Life, I was also working on some of the essays that were in Flowers at the same time. So even like that project, I was kind of like going back and forth. And in that particular instance, it was fiction and then book reviews. But still, it was like that element of like different ways of thinking about like language, thinking about what you're trying to express, and for me that's super helpful.
Yes. So let's talk about Flowers Among the Carrion. This is an interesting book for me. So I think when Meg suggested you, it was specifically because of my interest in the Gothic. And so she's like, you got to read this book. And I have not read any of the books that you're talking about in here. I do have Which, you know, like, I haven't read most of the books, so that it's really no big deal. I've had Johannes on the show, and
Oh yeah,
I
I
have
remember that. Yeah.
read the Necropastoral from Joyelle, maybe twice at this point, and I talk about it with people all the time. That book has sort of become canonized within my friend group.
Oh yeah, yeah, great book. Yeah.
And so yeah, I haven't read the Sugar book, but I've read Summer, and kind of,
Mm.
you know, I I have a basis of knowledge to work off of.
Mm.
But so what I find is my thing with the Gothic or anything related to Goth is that I feel like I'm always wrong about what I think it is. When I was a kid in the aughts, and I hung out with kids who bought their baggy, strappy, chained pants from Hot Topic and wore Slipknot t-shirts, that was goth to me.
Yeah.
And now in my 30s, it is difficult for me to look at The Cure and be like, that's goth, actually. And then to, you know, draw connections between Gothic architecture and the wealth of literature that there is. And now the internet has created subcultures based off of various American regional Gothics.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And essentially I feel like I'm running out now of new avenues of goth
Mhm.
to discover. So I'm running out of these assumptions to have proven wrong or suggested to be wrong. But I think to myself, okay, Gothic architecture, it's this very like ornate churches. I read an article in like Architecture Daily about Gothic architecture and how it was this very like kind of future forward. This is like
Yeah.
new
Yeah.
technologies that we're using, these flying buttresses and these super crazy arches and everything. And I think to
Yeah.
myself, okay, cool. So like Midwestern Gothic has got to be Frank Lloyd Wright. And I'm wrong. It's like Midwestern Gothic is apparently fields and broken down Fords and you know, rusty metal whatever out in
Oh yeah.
the brush. And it takes me a long time whenever I run into a new avenue of Gothic whatever to kind of understand what element of the sort of overarching Edmund Burkean whatever that is being displayed. So like Midwestern Gothic and the sort of fields and farms and broken down cars, that sort of thing is not all that different in the emotions that it evokes as a crumbling Gothic cathedral, right? Because it at some point the family farm, the Midwestern parcel was a future facing. We've left Europe, we've left the East, and we are here on what is at this point the frontier, and this is how we're going to set up generational prosperity for everybody. And now that's not the case, right? Like now it's
Oh yeah.
the
Yeah.
crumbling, rusted out Ford in the backyard. So it, you know, Gothic whatever is just kind of fascinating to me, not the least because whatever the aesthetic is, I like it, right? I like the Hot Topic stuff. I do like the Susie and the Banshees, the Cure stuff. I like old crumbling castles. I like ghost stories. And whatever the kids these days are doing with it now, I'm sure I'll like that once I've had enough time to adjust to it. But so I'm, and then the idea, of course, that there is the Gothic in contemporary poetry is not even something I had considered. So I was coming into this book with a whole bunch of just like, all right, let's see what there is. So kind of, yeah. What do you have for me with all of that?
No, those are really good points. Yeah, when you brought up the Gothic cathedral, that's really interesting. I never really thought about it that way in terms of it being like future forward and using these kind of like at that point new technologies, because we often think of like Gothic cathedrals as so far in the past and being these kind of time haunted structures, that sort of thing. So thinking about it as something which is actually kind of like futuristic is it's like like really intriguing. Actually, when you say that, it kind of reminded me of like the Alien films, especially the very first Alien movie, which is like clearly influenced by like Gothic architecture, the Gothic sensibility. Overall, there's even like the xenomorph creature has a kind of like Gothic element to it. So yeah, I think that's a really intriguing idea. I think the for me, like one of the basic elements of the Gothic is that it is like shape shifting. Like when you think of like classic Gothic creatures like the werewolf. Somebody who's like part human, part wolf. Or like a Frankenstein's creature who's designed by all these different body parts, and they're all sewn together. So it's not like a kind of like classical wholeness. There's something more fragmented, something more shape-shifting about it. And that's something that I really find unique about the Gothic, is the way that it has morphed in like all these different directions. So like on one level, the Gothic is novels of like Matthew Lewis, like the Monk, novels that are like hundreds of years old now. But it's also The Cure. It's also Joy Division. Yes, so it incorporates and brings in all these different elements and gets redefined and sometimes radically redefined throughout these different generations. And there is something about the undead aspect of it. It is like a zombie from a Romero film where it just keeps on springing up. You think the Gothic is just like passe. It's like nobody's interested in it. Suddenly it just emerges again. And a lot of people have talked about how like, at the moment there's like a lot of like really great horror films. Sinners like came out recently. Get Out, something like it's really kind of like a renaissance of like horror cinema in the U.S. at this point, everything kind of like worldwide as well. And I think in the context of American poetry, well, maybe I should talk about like just like taking a step back. So I grew up like in the 80s. I'm like really old now, so I was a kid of the 80s, and like a lot of like kids from the 80s grew up like reading like Stephen King, watching films about like Romero. And for me, like that was kind of like the Gothic, and then I got into like Gothic music, punk rock first, and then Gothic music, and that was like very much my sensibility. And then when I went into grad school, this would have been in the late '90s. The Gothic studies was just emerging. And Gothic studies basically was making the argument that, the Gothic isn't just ghoulish fun. It's that too. But there's something more serious there. The Gothic is exploring these cultural and historical and political tensions that often in literature in a more realist mode get like tamped down, to get repressed. And I thought that was just an amazing idea. And so like Gothic studies, I remember I took a class where we watched the original Cat People. We read Le Fanu's Carmilla, still one of my favorite texts of all time. I love Carmilla. And in that class, I talked about the historical context of these narratives and how, through the Gothic, they were kind of like bringing up these issues that often weren't really discussed in more realist modes. And so for me, that's also part of the Gothic, that one, the element of the Gothic that does examine those subterranean kind of like underground elements of our culture that are often repressed, that are often kind of like disregarded, and bringing those to the foreground. And you definitely see that in a movie like Get Out, for example, where it's like very much bringing up issues of like like race and class, and using the Gothic to explore that sensibility. David Lynch's films. I'm a really big David Lynch fan, and David Lynch's films definitely do that as well, I would argue. I mean, they're not kind of like traditionally gothic. The doesn't like there's no ravens, cemeteries. He's also clearly really influenced by noir, but there's still, I would argue at least, a kind of like gothic undercurrent. The use of doppelgangers that you see there throughout so many of his movies. That's definitely a gothic trope, interesting, fruitful Gothic trope that I think he employs for like really interesting ways, especially in a movie like Mulholland Drive or Lost Highway. And so for me, I guess the way like one way I would define the Gothic is that it is incredibly shape-shifting, and trying to like hold it down and say it's simply like this one thing is really impossible. I think that one of the things that gives the Gothic such vitality, a kind of like undead vitality, is the way, this way in which it's always a little bit unexpected in that regard, and it's always recreating, regenerating itself in different modes.
I'm glad you said the thing about David Lynch, because I've been thinking about that too. The more I kind of learn about, the Edmund Burke of it all, and the word doppelganger has come up a couple of times, and that's such a theme in his work. To the point where if Twin Peaks had gone the way he originally intended it, there would have been more. There would have been another. There would have been a red-haired Laura showing up at some point, and so on. So I like that. I also think about terminally online as I am, this perennial argument among goths, people identifying as such, about whether or not it is a primarily music subculture or a primarily fashion-based subculture, which is interesting to me as a person who, I don't know. I would maybe call myself goth more than anything if you put a gun to my head and said, "What subculture are you?" Sort of like, I don't know, if your dad was goth. That's kind of how I style myself. Not in the summer because it's too damn hot, but when I can dress, that's kind of how I try to dress. And going back to me thinking I need to follow rules or whatever, like realizing that was how I was going to try to want to dress. This is around the time my daughter was born, so 3-ish years ago, being like, yeah, goth dad, that's what I'm going to be. And then sitting there and kind of like just going through Sisters of Mercy and Susie and the Banshees and all of these discographies to, build some credibility for myself. Because even when I hung out with goth kids, what is now referred to as mall goth back in the aughts, like I was not listening to Slipknot at that point either. I just liked those kids. And I was listening to the White Stripes and Cake and They Might Be Giants because I have never been cool. But, so I appreciate that you are asserting for me kind of that my discomfort with the definition-ness of the Gothic is just going to be kind of how it is until I accept that it is unpin downable.
Oh yeah. And that's an interesting question in terms of like sort of like the implied question, like we were talking about like music and fashion, like what is like the true goth subculture, like how gothic sensibility expresses itself in these very different ways. So like you have like the literary gothic, you have like fashion, you have like music, and like what is a kind of thematic similarity, I guess you could say, between all of these different modes, or even like a philosopher like a Eugene Thacker. I mean, Eugene Thacker is very much a goth philosopher. I mean, it's the way that he talks about in the depths of this planet, like this, like the absolute sadness of being here on Earth and that sort of thing. Um, and yeah. I mean, I think that's a really intriguing question too. Like, what is, what is that thread, throughout? And I have to, for myself, I know a lot of people define the Gothic as being like really, depressive and just kind of like low energy and just melancholic, filled with ennui, and that is there. But for me, at least, there's also something like really it's vital and galvanizing about the Gothic. And thinking about like, I guess like thinking back to like Gothic architecture, like all those like intricate details flowing upwards, and or like ambient music, like they have like a dark ambient music. There's something so releasing about it. It just like feels like this huge like cosmic scale. And so for me, that the Gothic, I mean, I do agree that there is obviously something heavily melancholic about it, but there's also something really weirdly joyful about it. I'm not even quite sure how to express it, but it's been true for me for a long time that, like, when I watch, say, like a horror film, or like when I read like a Gothic novel, the thing that really intrigues me is something that I feel more energy afterwards usually than before. I feel like there's like that adrenaline rush. There's that sense of like, okay, the world is an unsettling place, and that's okay. And you just kind of have to like go with that weirdness, that vastness. And so for me, I always felt like the Gothic is sort of like energizing in that strange way.
Yeah, I think so too. I feel like one of the most simple definitions of goth that I come across on the internet is like finding beauty in the darker aspects of life.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And yeah, finding beauty, I think, is experiencing beauty is energizing. And it is liberating to, see it where it's obvious in flowers and a sunny day and puppies and whatever.
Oh, yeah.
But to also be able to extract it from a graveyard or an abandoned building is, I think, kind of just makes you more powerful, because it lets you kind of roll with whatever is going on. Though, it does seem that, with the exception of some subcultures, that the sort of accepted line of Gothic people is that we're not interested in puppies and flowers and rainbows or whatever. But if you could allow yourself to be, then And Thacker, the only thing I've read from him is Dust of This Planet, and yeah, like it's he's obviously very Schopenhauerian. And I think it was maybe early this year I read Ligatti's The Conspiracy Against the Human Race.
I've read his fiction. I never have read that though, but I've read quite a bit of his fiction though.
I found it to be, it left me with this like unsatisfied so what. Because his like hard line pessimism is like, it's all bad and there's nothing you can do about it. And like all I can think to say is like, okay, fine, dog. Like he even will address I think the philosopher he's cribbing from a lot in that book is called his last name is Zapfa, maybe it's Danish, I think. Who has like the 4 reactions to understanding that everything's bad and there's nothing you can do. And one of them, I guess, is like where I would be, which is just like deluding yourself or sublimating, and just kind of like trying to pretend that isn't the case or whatever. But for me, for reading it at if I did read it this year, it must have been in January. And I don't know, January 2025, I was maybe not necessarily super receptive to the idea that it's all bad and it doesn't matter what you do and it's always going to be bad.
Oh yeah, 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 yeah. No, yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's and like I haven't read his nonfiction. I haven't read Conspiracy Against the Human Race, but I've read quite a bit of his fiction. And this is probably going to like piss off some people by saying this, but I always feel like I mean, I like some of his short stories a lot, but I do feel like there is that sense of like, okay, like yeah, as you were saying, like everything is bleak, everything is just like awful, just like awful, awful, awful. And there is just kind of after a while, you just feel like, kind of, as you were saying, like, yeah, like, so what, like, okay, you know. And I always like the stories of his. There's one called The Night School, which is probably my favorite story of his. The ones that lean more into that sense of like mystery or enigma, that sense of like just the planet. It came like almost like kind of like David Lynchian element of like this like really weird, mysterious, and sometimes beautiful world, you know. Whereas like some of his short stories, I definitely, there's again just completely speaking for myself here. Do feel somewhat repetitive, where it feels like, okay, there's this like the philosophy he has that he's trying to express in these stories, and it is usually the same philosophical idea. Yeah, there's actually think about like the Gothic and that element of like melancholy and energy and stuff like that. One of my favorite books about horror is actually Deleuze's book on Francis Bacon. Which I think is called, I'm probably going to fuck up the title. I think it's called like Logic of Sensation. And in that book, he talks about how Bacon, as a painter, uses these kind of pessimistic energies, but in this kind of perversely joyful way. And it's just a fantastic book. I mean, I'm a pretty big Deleuze fan anyway, but that book especially because it's like Deleuze, like leaning into these more kind of Gothic modes, I guess, talking about Bacon. But for me, that's like that's part of the Gothic that often gets lost. This idea that Francis Bacon, there is this like this like dynamic, kinetic energy to it. And yeah, it's like filled of like these monsters and screaming mouths and cages and ghostly figures and all that. But still, there's just like this like hallowing energy, to it. And I feel like that sometimes that element of the Gothic that I personally really like does sometimes get shoved aside when there is like so much focus on just like ennui and nihilism and this everything is just like shit basically. And it's like, okay, that's that's partially true, but I also think this other side of the Gothic is equally true. Or going back to like the very early the very first English Gothic novels, The Monk. The Monk is just like bristling with all this like weirdly negative energy. There's like demons coursing throughout, and it's a really savage, disturbing book, but nobody can say that it's a boring book. It's just, there's there is just like you got this. He wrote it when he was like 21, 22, kind of like Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein at 19. He was like really young when he wrote it, and you get the sense that he just like sat down on the desk and thought to himself, I'm going to write some like really disturbing shit today, and just like went all for it. That the full throttle element. And so for me, books like the Monk, paintings by Francis Bacon, that's Frankenstein is another great example. Frankenstein, for as incredibly depressing as it is, I mean, you get the sense that Mary Shelley had a hell of a time writing it. So for me, that's a part of the Gothic that I personally tend to respond to the most.
Yeah. I also this year read a memoir of Michael Pepiot's Francis Bacon in Your Blood, about his lifelong friendship with Francis Bacon. And yeah, I mean, that dude had, nobody drinks that much if they're a happy person. Even if they're not as destructive as they could be. But yeah, like Bacon used color,
yeah, exactly. Like those like paintings in the last decades, those like really intense pinks that he has in reds. I mean, yeah, completely.
And obviously Bacon influenced Lynch a whole bunch. So I do want to kind of get your feeling of where Gothic in contemporary poetry is at. Like you talked about it in the book. You brought up these four other books, but maybe even beyond that. Like, are you seeing a current right now, or is it still kind of off in its little pocket?
Yeah, no, I think, that's a really good question. So when I wrote the book, more or less in 2013, 2014, then it was published in 2016. So yeah, when I wrote it, it was a very different kind of like literary climate. I would say that like in the 90s and the aughts, there was this sense in like poetry that the Gothic was just ridiculous. That you had like the influence, and I talk about this, in the book. You have like the influence of like Whitman and like Whitman's extreme, like optimism. You have Ezra Pound and the idea of like, make it new, make it the implication, like make it like sleek, get rid of like the Victorian dross, the Victorian melancholy, make it sleek like a shiny car, like some kind of like futuristic machine. And I feel like that's when I was like in grad school in the 90s and the early aughts, that was still part of the poetry scene. And you can like see that with conceptualism as well. Conceptualism is about poetry should be about readership. It should be about the mind. It should be about these verbal debates, but it maybe shouldn't be soul crushing. It shouldn't be super emotional and that sort of thing. So when I was like writing the book, I think it was like a different climate, because I was like rereading parts of the book for the podcast. And there is a kind of like a defensive tone for the Gothic, which I think if I wrote it today, I probably wouldn't have, because I think that Gothic element of poetry is much more accepted today than it was, back then. And part of it because of presses like Action Books, Johannes and Joel's press, our mutual friend Meg, who's was an editor for Tarpaulin Sky. So I think that's part of it. And just kind of like just overall, there just seems to be more of an acceptance of that kind of writing. Even like a writer like Kaveh Akbar, who I'm a big fan of, his poetry I feel like has a kind of like Gothic undercurrent. I mean, nobody really calls him a Gothic poet per se. But I think Akbar's, their parts just like has like a Gothic, undercurrent. But yeah. So I think it is more accepted than it used to be in that way.
Yeah. Something you said about Pound flipped a switch in my head, sort of maybe opened a door. This idea of his politics and this idea of like sleek and shiny and new, and thinking about the like the Italian futurist painters who are all fascists, and we're doing this, that sort of thing with painting. And thinking about that, the fascists are obsessed with the past too, but it is a different type of past that they're obsessed with, right? The Roman statue, whatever, and not, the crumbling aqueduct on the, Scottish moors or whatever. And I have no conclusions. I've just like written a thing down on my notepad that I'll
I think that's I think that's a really interesting point, that the Gothic, with its interest in like cemeteries and ruins, it does tend to emphasize this idea of like the sort of like the limitations of the human centric, I guess you could say. Whereas like fascism tends to be extremely human centric, that the fascism tends to put like a human face on everything. It's about will, it's about power, it's about domination. Whereas, the Gothic is sort of like suffused with this sense that, that we're on this planet, and whatever, like Ozymandias, the idea that no matter how much power you might think you have, or a group of people might think they have, that eventually it's going to crumble. And search for the Gothic, I would argue that it is a very different relationship to the past because it emphasizes this idea of finitude, this idea of human limitations, this idea that the world is larger than just our human moment. Whereas fascism, I think, does the opposite. It emphasizes those moments of the past that are about domination. The Roman emperors. That's that sort of thing. It's,
It's that time in the show where my brain, where my hosting brain has stopped because my thinking brain has started. Real quick before we end, I also want to talk about Mineral Planet because I found that to be such an interesting book too. Sort of prosy type poems. The thing that struck me the most, I think, was this sort of like constant juxtaposition happening, like even in the title, Mineral Planet, like a very, very small with very big. And I feel like that's kind of a thread throughout the entirety of the book.
Oh yeah. Mineral Planet. When I wrote, it's probably, I mean, compared to like the Fassbender Diaries, and then the book that I'm currently working on. I really wanted to have a consistency of style with that one. And so that's why you have like the backslashes, throughout. So there's no, and there are like commas, but there's no periods. It just has like the backslashes throughout. I wanted to have it be the feel of like not just like a single poem, but all these poems being like connected somehow. So you could read it as like one individual poem per page, but you could also read it as just like one extended poem, basically. So and also when I was writing that, I did have like a fairly specific, not even like a theme per se, but more of a kind of like a mood I was trying to express. And yeah, something that was like very Gothic, but also something that had like elements of like masquerade, something somewhat like a festive, a Danse Macabre kind of like element to it. So more so than the other projects I've worked on. That one did have a kind of like a singular vision that I was trying to express, a singular sensibility I was trying to express. And I think I was like thinking of like certain like horror films that I've seen, like maybe like late at night when you're kind of like half asleep and it's like 2 a.m, you're just like flipping through channels and you see this like really weird, fucked up horror scene moment. You're not even quite sure how to connect it to the rest of the narrative. I remember like one time I was, this was when I was in high school. It was like kind of like late on a Halloween night. And PBS was showing The Mask of the Red Death. And that moment, like Lon Chaney with, the mask, he's like walking down the steps. And it was like really late. I had like eaten like lots of candy. I was like in kind of like almost hallucinating at that point. And there's something like, so that does have like that kind of like festive element. So, so I guess like Mineral Planet, that's a sensibility I was trying to get attuned with, that I was trying to like bring out in the writing, that element of a kind of like fucked up masquerade, some sort of like dark festivity, and in some way. So this is from Mineral Planet, and I'll just read the first, like roughly first 10 or 11 pages from Mineral Planet. All right. From up there was no smoke to see. Gray thread curling up from bright charcoals where the eyes once shifted. How I heard one game ending in the next room, another one lighting its matches among the garlands and urns in the den, ash drips from the seams of the windows. Throats painted with fingertip blood. I heard what they said from the floorboards. A balcony from which the vinyl ones wrestled and descended. Honey-dripped wings latched into the blades of each shoulder, snug and sewn hard. Crimson vinyl tight on every inch, a tongue wet from cold blue milk, leashes of garland from baluster to baluster, joint to corroded joint. From the horizon, roads digging into the forest, it stitched and threaded fires, through the slong, falling upwards and over. The game neither older nor newer, the sky neither colder nor warmer, The fronds part memory and part landscape. Figures with mineral mouths, chewing, muttering. They told me of their practices in eradicating codes. A number channel on the radio folded into a blank summer day, edges torn with light, an hour in July behind the diner, framed by an autochrome sky. I heard the angels hissing. I felt the spider in their spider corners. Laptop screen fastened to the northern wall, lava glittering forth. Underneath and all around, caves of hot fog, breastbones of saturated fur, mineral planet, ash planet, planet with glowing charcoal eyes, planet of remembrance and abhorrence, planet of star and seed, poison and petal, eye and echo. A tunnel from which an amphitheater emerged, pink in the crestfallen light. A dying sun among the newborn stars, languages of oxen and rosewater. I crouched by the tree. I dipped my hands into the reflection of the branches, a chemical pond shimmering in the carbonized heat. Nothing ever heard from there nor found. Skies encased in skies under our feet. Nothing slipping underneath and through which the cheek joined briefly with jaw. Arms among the branches pointed downwards into earth, fingers flexing, letting go, red moon wide as the sun, bite grips in the palms of each spent hand. I rode out to the stone tower, the bird-shed window seals, ruins of a picnic in the front lawn, porcelain angels with outstretched faces, rust in the curvatures between the wing and spine, storms over the eastern mountain gathering their satin drapery. Little remains, or was meant to. Wicker chair weeds. Cherubs stare from the ceiling, their thoughts with no core, only passages in corridors. I am their insect, their breathing bird. Ceremonial figures walking with bared feet over filthy carpets, plush vine patterns. Sister Midnight, I pray like a pierced mask. Homer's arrow in our throats, odd-shaped meats crackling over bonfires, our cups gathering drift and ash, flakes from the dark overhead, night latched snug with latex stars. Sister Midnight, your red middle glow. Several all at once, and then none ever again. All right, and then I'll read just one more. It was over before it started. This ruin, taken further, curdled milk, mossy jaws, translucent bellies, a million melting edifices along the reflective waterscape, the hum in the clean cafe, the two of them across the table, shores of pink sugar light, raw expressions in the bark they passed by, the snow-stitched beach, frost breath seeping in, dusk extinguishing the rooms from basement to attic, night enfolding the trees, traffic lights dangling over blank roads. Off the lakeshore, the couple blended, webbed, worked, and extricated, shoulders and calves in stillness and not stillness, dunes of grit and glitter and their steady unmaking. Then dressing in black wet garments, sniffing their more intimate drugs, remnants of themselves left behind, sickly sweet corruption, curdled, mossy, unbleached, unmoored. This film decades ago, an emerald storm, clouds with their human features unwinding, dissolving, lightning from below, not above.